Epic wide-angle cinematic scene of the Battle of Bunker Hill, June 17, 1775. Viewed from behind the American colonial militiamen's defensive lines. The central focus is on the Breed's Hill Redoubt, a square earthen fort with determined patriots in homespun clothing firing muskets over the parapet. In the foreground, a low stone wall defended by New Hampshire regiments where Colonel John Stark stands resolute. In the midground, perfectly organized lines of British redcoats in bright scarlet uniforms advancing uphill across the Charlestown Peninsula. Their bayonets glinting in the afternoon sun. The background shows the Boston harbor filled with British warships, their cannons firing, smoke billowing from their broadsides. The sky is filled with thick clouds of black powder smoke, the entire scene illuminated by dramatic cinematic lighting that highlights the tension and chaos of the battle. Hyper-realistic, detailed historical accuracy, 8K resolution, epic scale, sense of motion and action, style of a big-budget historical film production. The Battle of Bunker Hill, a tactical defeat, a strategic victory. Prologue. The Tinderbox of Boston, 1775. The spring of 1775 in Massachusetts was a season of simmering rebellion and palpable tension. The shots fired at Lexington and Concord on April 19 had echoed far beyond those two small towns, shattering any lingering hope of a peaceful reconciliation between Great Britain and its 13 American colonies. The British expedition to seize colonial munitions had been a bloody disaster, culminating in a harrowing retreat back to the relative safety of Boston under constant fire from militia companies pouring in from across the countryside. In the aftermath, the ad hoc colonial forces, a mix of anger and newfound purpose hardening their resolve, laid a loose siege to the peninsular city of Boston. By June, over 15,000 colonial militiamen from the New England colonies had answered the call, encircling the city from Roxbury to Chelsea. Their camps were a chaotic but determined assemblage of farmers, tradesmen, and merchants, united by a common cause but lacking in formal military structure, discipline, or supplies. They were an army in name only, a armed mob in the eyes of the British professionals trapped within Boston. Commanding the British garrison was Lieutenant General Thomas Gage, a man increasingly out of his depth. Once seen as a competent administrator, Gage now found himself presiding over an armed camp, his authority challenged by a rebellion he had failed to foresee or quash. His forces, a powerful army of over 6,000 regulars, were bottled up, their strategic mobility nullified by the surrounding hordes of militia. Gage knew he had to break the siege. The Colonial Command, an uneasy committee appointed by the nascent Continental Congress and known as the Council of War, knew they had to maintain it. Both sides understood that the first major battle was coming, it was only a question of when and where. The answer lay in the geography of the Charlestown Peninsula, a drumlin-rich landmass north of Boston. Two hills dominated this peninsula: Bunker Hill, 110 feet high at its summit, and Breed's Hill, a smaller 62-foot rise closer to Boston and its harbor. In the 18th century, artillery was the key to domination. Whichever army controlled these heights could emplace cannon and render Boston indefensible. For the British, taking the hills was essential to breaking the siege. For the Americans, holding them was the key to maintaining it. 2. The American Gambit, the Midnight March. On June 15, the Massachusetts Committee of Safety, aware of British intentions to seize Dorchester Heights to the south, decided to preempt them. They issued orders to the Council of War to fortify Bunker Hill. The command fell to Colonel William Prescott, a veteran of the French and Indian War from Pepperell, Massachusetts. Prescott was a man of granite resolve and natural leadership, respected by his men. He was ordered to lead a detachment of about 1,200 men onto the peninsula under cover of darkness and construct fortifications. On the night of June 16, under a wan moon, Prescott's column assembled on the Common in Cambridge. They were a motley crew: Prescott's own regiment, a contingent from Connecticut under Captain Thomas Knowlton, and a unit from New Hampshire under Colonel John Stark and Colonel James Reed. They carried muskets, but their most important tools were entrenching tools, shovels, picks, and axes. Their mission was one of engineering, not combat, at least, not yet. In a fateful decision that would forever confuse the battle's name, the colonial engineers on the ground, Richard Gridley and Prescott himself, made a crucial tactical choice upon arriving on the peninsula. Bunker Hill, the original objective, was farther from Boston Harbor. Breed's Hill, though lower, was more prominent from the water and closer to the city, making it a more immediate threat. Reasoning that the threat was the point, they chose to build their primary fortification on Breed's Hill. This was an aggressive, perhaps even arrogant, move. It placed the rebel fort directly under the guns of the British Navy. The men set to work with a frantic energy. They knew dawn would bring discovery and certain bombardment. Under the direction of Gridley, they laid out a square redoubt, about 130 feet on a side, with earthen walls and a deep ditch. There was no time for sleep. Through the night, the only sounds were the quiet commands of officers, the thud of shovels biting into the soft earth, and the grunts of men moving heavy sod. By the first light of dawn on June 17, 1775, a formidable-looking earthen fort had materialized where none had stood the evening before. It was a stunning feat of overnight labor. 3. British discovery and reaction. They will be ours in 2 hours. Aboard His Majesty's ship Lively, 20 guns, anchored in the Charles River, a sharp-eyed sailor was the first to notice the transformation of the skyline. Where there had been an empty hilltop hours before, there now stood a military fortification. The alarm was raised. Without waiting for orders from Admiral Samuel Graves, the Lively's captain opened fire. The thunder of cannon fire shattered the morning calm, the first official shots of the battle. Soon, other ships joined the bombardment, the Falcon, the Somerset, and the massive Glasgow. Cannonballs whistled through the air, tearing into the fresh earth of the redoubt or sailing harmlessly over the heads of the digging Americans. The bombardment was terrifying but largely ineffective. The soft earth absorbed the impact of the shots, and the men, now huddled within the walls of their redoubt, were relatively safe. In Boston, General Gage was alerted. He convened his senior commanders, Major Generals William Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne. These were not mere garrison officers, they were among the best the British Army had to offer, sent to reinforce Gage and crush the rebellion. Looking through telescopes from Copp's Hill in the North End, they surveyed the American position. The legendary arrogance of the British officer corps was on full display. Clinton, the most cautious of the three, suggested a flanking maneuver to cut off the peninsula and trap the rebels. But Howe, who would lead the assault, dismissed the idea. He favored the doctrine of the day, a direct, disciplined, and overwhelming frontal assault. The rebels, he was certain, would break and run before the might of a British bayonet charge. It is said that Burgoyne remarked, "Well, let us get in, and then we are sure of them. The rascals will be off before we get halfway up." The plan was simple. Howe would lead the main assault force across the harbor. They would land on the southeastern tip of the peninsula, form their lines, and march straight up Breed's Hill to storm the redoubt. It was a textbook plan, one that had worked against European armies for decades. They expected the battle to be over by lunchtime. IV. Preparations for the storm. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. As the British preparations commenced, the American command structure showed its chaotic nature. Reinforcements and senior officers trickled onto the peninsula, but coordination was poor. General Israel, Old Putnam, a fiery veteran from Connecticut, rode back and forth between Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill, exhorting men to build more defenses and sending for more troops, but often countermanding his own orders in his fervor. Crucially, he failed to ensure a steady supply of ammunition and water was brought forward. Prescott, inside the redoubt, watched the British Armada assemble. Dozens of longboats began ferrying Howe's elite light infantry and grenadier across the water. It was a magnificent and terrifying sight, the sun glinting off hundreds of bayonets and the brilliant red of their uniforms. The professionalism and discipline of the enemy were on stark display. Prescott's immediate concern was his flanks. The redoubt was strong, but it could be outflanked. He ordered a detachment to build a rail fence, stuffed with freshly cut hay, running from the redoubt down to the Mystic River. This line was reinforced by Captain Knowlton's Connecticut men and later, decisively, by Colonel Stark's New Hampshire regiment. Stark, a cool and calculating fighter, saw the weak point on the beach along the Mystic River. He built a crude stone wall there, stacking rocks 3 high, and posted 3 ranks of his best marksmen behind it. This would prove to be one of the most critical decisions of the battle. Inside the redoubt, the mood was tense. The men were exhausted from a night of digging, thirsty under the June sun, and low on ammunition. They had perhaps 30 or 40 rounds per man, and no reserve supply. It was in this context that the legendary order was given. While often attributed to Prescott, It was more likely given by Putnam or Stark, or was simply a phrase that echoed along the line, a piece of essential, common-sense advice that became immortal. "Men, you are all marksmen," an officer cried. "Don't one of you fire until you see the white of their eyes." The order was not mere bravado, it was a dire necessity. To waste a single shot was to risk the entire position. The first assault, a perfect storm of iron. At about 3 p.m., the British were ready. General Howe, elegant in his uniform, led the main body of over 1,500 men directly toward the redoubt and the rail fence. A second force, under Brigadier General Robert Piggott, moved against the redoubt itself. The day was hot, and the British soldiers were weighed down by heavy wool uniforms and packs that could weigh over 125 pounds. They advanced across open fields, their progress slowed by high grass, fences, and drainage ditches. The Americans waited in silence. The only sound was the steady, unnerving beat of British drums and the fifes playing, the British Grenadier. They watched the perfect lines of redcoats march closer. 100 yards, 75 yards, 50 yards. The order to fire was held. The tension was unbearable. Then, at a distance of 40 yards, point-blank range for a musket, the American line erupted in a single, shattering volley. The sound was not of individual shots, but of a perfect storm of iron. The effect was catastrophic. The tightly packed British ranks were eviscerated. Dozens of men fell at once. Officers, leading from the front, were primary targets and were cut down in droves. The advance shuddered to a halt. For a moment, the disciplined British lines stood in shocked disbelief, then they broke and streamed back down the hill, leaving the field littered with their dead and wounded. Howe was stunned. He had never seen such concentrated fire from colonial militia. His own staff had been nearly wiped out around him. He reformed his shattered ranks on the beach, his confidence shaken but his resolve hardened. The rebels would pay for this insult. The second assault, history repeats. After a tense pause of nearly 30 minutes, the British drums began to beat again. The lines were redressed, and the bloody advance began a second time. The soldiers marched now with grim determination, stepping over the bodies of their fallen comrades. Once again, the Americans held their fire with incredible discipline. The same scene played out. The British marched to within 40 yards. The same devastating volley erupted from the American lines. The result was the same. The British lines were again torn apart by the precise and concentrated musket fire. The attack faltered, then collapsed. The survivors retreated back down the slope in even greater disorder than before. The field was now carpeted with red. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the screams of the wounded. Panic began to grip the British command. Howe, for the first time, considered the possibility of failure. His forces had taken over 50% casualties in some companies. He sent an urgent message back to General Gage in Boston for reinforcements. Every available man was rushed across the harbor. This was no longer a simple punitive expedition, it was a battle for the honor of the British Army. 7. The third and final assault, ammunition and bayonets. For the Americans, the two successful repulses were a triumph of morale, but they concealed a critical weakness: their ammunition was almost exhausted. Many men were down to their last 3 or 4 rounds, some had only one, and many had none. Appeals for more powder and shot had gone largely unanswered due to the command disarray. Howe, reinforced with fresh troops including the Royal Marines, prepared for a third assault. This time, he altered his tactics. He would still press the front, but the main effort would be a final, overwhelming push against the redoubt itself. Furthermore, the British artillery, which had been firing ineffectively with cannonballs, was now loaded with grapeshot, devastating clusters of small metal projectiles that acted like a giant shotgun, perfect for clearing defensive walls. The final advance began. The British soldiers, now stripped of their heavy packs, moved with more speed and fury. The American fire was initially just as effective, but it quickly became sporadic and then fell almost silent as their ammunition ran out. The British artillery found its mark, sweeping the top of the redoubt with grapeshot, cutting down defenders. The redcoats sensed the change. With a fierce cheer, they surged forward, storming over the ditch and up the earthen walls of the redoubt. The fighting at the wall became desperate and hand-to-hand. The Americans, with no bayonets of their own, used the butts of their muskets as clubs, threw rocks, and fought with their bare hands. It was a brutal, savage melee. Colonel Prescott, fighting with his saber, knew the position was lost. He gave the order to retreat. The exit from the redoubt became a bloody funnel as men tried to escape the British bayonets. The retreat, while harrowing, was not a complete rout. Men fought a rearguard action as they fell back across the Charlestown Neck to the safety of the mainland. The British, exhausted and bloodied, did not press a vigorous pursuit. They had taken the hill, but at a cost so horrific it left them stunned. 8. The aftermath, a Pyrrhic victory. The British held the field. They had achieved their tactical objective. But the cost was unprecedented. Of the approximately 2,400 British troops engaged, 1,054 had become casualties, 226 killed and 828 wounded. The officer corps was devastated, a loss from which the army in America would not quickly recover. General Henry Clinton, surveying the carnage, later wrote in his diary, "A few more such victories would have shortly put an end to British dominion in America." American losses were significant but far lighter, approximately 450 killed, wounded, or captured. They had lost ground but achieved something far more important. They had proven to themselves and to the world that they could stand against the finest army in the world and inflict crippling losses. The myth of British invincibility was shattered forever. The battle had immediate strategic consequences. It hardened the resolve of both sides, making compromise even more unlikely. It convinced the Second Continental Congress to formally adopt the New England Army, creating the Continental Army and appointing George Washington as its commander-in-chief just days later. For the British, it instilled a sense of caution and resentment that would shape their tactics for the rest of the war. Its legacy and the name. The battle's name is its final irony. Though the objective was Bunker Hill and the final stand was on Breed's Hill, the entire engagement was immortalized by the higher ground. The Battle of Bunker Hill entered the American lexicon as a symbol of courageous defiance. The battle was not a military victory for the Americans, but it was a colossal psychological and political one. It demonstrated that the rebellion was not a trivial affair to be crushed by a few regiments. It was a war. And as the news spread across the colonies and to Europe, it announced that the Americans would not be easily subdued. They had stood on a hill and traded volley for volley with the British Empire, and though they had been forced to retreat, they had won something invaluable, the belief that they could win. The Battle of Bunker Hill was a testament to the power of determination over discipline, of belief over tradition. It was the day the American Revolution truly began.